Well, members of Parliament are following the proceedings at the inquiry quite closely, and to talk about what we heard from the Mayor in his testimony, we're now joined by Yasir Naqvi. He's the Liberal MP for the riding of Ottawa Centre, as well as Matthew Green, who is the NDP Member of Parliament for the riding of Hamilton Centre in Ontario. Hello to the two of you.
Hi.
Listen, Mr. Naqvi, I'm going to begin with you because you're riding, of course, the epicenter of the protest. What's your reaction to Mayor Watson's assessment that the invocation was a positive step in dealing with the protest?
Well, I think what we heard from the Mayor today and what we've been hearing from the witnesses who have been before the Commission is really sort of demonstrating and reminding us what my community went through over the 24-day period in the beginning of the year. This protest was not nor lawful or peaceful. It was an occupation of downtown Ottawa, just not the street before Parliament Hill, but also the residential parts of downtown Ottawa. And the result was that so many members of my community were harassed. They were held essentially hostage for over 20 days in their own homes. Seniors who were not able to go to their medical appointments, or children who were not able to attend school because of the level of harassment and intimidation. I mean, we were seeing honking that was taking place all through the day and the night. There were fireworks in the middle of residential streets. And we are hearing from witnesses, including the Mayor, that things were out of control. There was no real sense of how this occupation is going to come to an end until the Emergencies Act was invoked, and that resulted in putting an end to this illegal occupation.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Green, you're on record as saying that invoking the act was, quote, have grave implications, but your party also supported the Trudeau government with the invocation. So how do you respond to what you heard from the Ottawa Mayor? Does it address the grave implications that you were concerned about?
Well, certainly we made the support based on the information that was publicly available, and of course based on the fact that we were also experiencing what people across the country were experiencing in terms of the occupation and witnessing the blockades. However, we were doing that based on the information that was publicly made available. What was clear is there was a failure of all levels of government, including the police. I certainly have some concerns and some of the contradictions that are coming up over the course of the inquiry. You know, we have a situation where it appears that many people involved are trying to pass the buck, but ultimately, you know, we're in a scenario where over these next weeks and ensuing months, we hope that we can get the facts of the matter in terms of who knew what when, and be able to provide recommendations back to the House and the Senate to ensure that this Emergency Act situation, this unprecedented, very historic situation, has a more fulsome set of definitions and responsibilities. Because what's clear is that in the onset of this, nobody really had a plan.
Well, I want to pick up on that point because, you know, we've yet to hear from the former police chief, but he will be appearing before the Commission later on. But what we have seen so far, or at least heard, are from city officials. And one interesting fact was the fact that the city officials in Ottawa, as well as local police, seem to believe that this was only going to be a weekend protest. And that's despite the media reports out there, that's despite the social media postings put out by the organizers of the protest themselves. So given that that was the impression, do you think the Emergencies Act would have been invoked had police done perhaps a better job of monitoring what this protest was about? Mr. Naqvi, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, we know the protest was taking place, and I don't know as to whether people understood that it will turn into an unlawful and unpeaceful occupation to the extent it did happen. You know, it is important to remind everyone that in our system, police is responsible for matters of policing, to ensure law and order, to ensure security. And politicians cannot tell police what to do or what not to do. So in this particular instance, I mean, I live in Ottawa. I represent downtown core, and so I was quite involved in a lot of the conversations that were taking place. When it came to the matters of operation and enforcement of the law, we were, of course, relying on Ottawa Police Service, because that is the police service that is responsible for providing security in the downtown core of the Ottawa, even parts that are next to Parliament Hill. And in this case, it's clear that police was not able to stop that occupation. In fact, it continued to grow, even though a lot of resources were being provided by both provincial government and federal government. And in the end of the day, there was no recourse left but to invoke the Emergencies Act that finally did the job. I just also want to remind the fact that we had 2 states of emergency in place in that 20-day period. Ottawa first declared one, and then Ontario declared the next one. But that still did not end the illegal occupation of Ottawa's downtown core, not to mention the blockades that were taking place on borders across the country.
But still, as we said, on social media, even before the protesters got to Ottawa, they were very clear that they were going to be here for some time. So, Mr. Green, what do you think? Had Ottawa police done a better job of responding to that, do you think the Emergencies Act would have been necessary?
No, I don't. I mean, at the end of the day, this was a wholesale breakdown of policing, and while Mr. Naqvi would like to suggest that politicians weren't involved, we come to know through testimony and disclosure that the mayor of Ottawa was involved. He was trying to negotiate with the organizers of this event. In fact, he facilitated a staging area off-site where they could be refueled and have food and have all of these different replenishments. And so this was a very murky situation, one that would have required strong national leadership across the country, one that would have had certainly premiers who were missing in action. Obviously, you know, Mr. Ford, under the Emergency Act there, could have used the Ministry of Transport to levy fines. The Attorney General of Ontario could have used aid to civil power, and yet none of that stuff occurred. It seemed like everybody was content to point their finger at somebody else, including, quite frankly, the federal government, by taking leadership to ensure that this stuff would come to an end.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Ontario Premier because he was in the Ottawa region, Western Ottawa, in fact, yesterday, and he was asked about the inquiry, asked about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Let's take a listen to what we heard from Doug Ford.
I stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. These folks were, you know, camping out. Everything from whirlpools, disrupting downtown, disrupting the lives of the people of Ottawa. We've worked collaboratively with the mayor and the Prime Minister over at the borders. They were holding up $1 billion of trade every single day, getting across our borders. We were getting phone calls from governors. It's unacceptable. Myself and I know the Prime Minister believe in free speech. And if you want to protest, protest. If you want to come down to Queen's Park and do cartwheels. But if you disrupt the lives of the people of Ottawa every single day, disrupt the lives, the economic flow across our borders, I have zero tolerance for it.
Now, I play that, Mr. Naqvi, because we did hear from the Mayor of Ottawa today describing really his frustration at the lack of urgency with which the Ontario provincial government initially responded to the protests. And yet here we have Doug Ford saying that he was standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister at the time. What do you make of that?
Well, I was delighted to hear the Premier reconfirm his support for the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It highlights that both federal government and provincial government was working in tandem when it comes to ending the occupation, which had lasted for 24 days. I think it's really important to remember that the step to invoke the Emergency Act was an unprecedented step. It's never been done in its 30 years history, and the federal government had to be very cautious and make sure that we do the appropriate consultations, and that's why it did take the step when it did to not only end the occupation here in Ottawa, but also to make sure that no other blockades of our border crossings across the country takes place. One of the most important, I think, aspect of this inquiry is to learn from what happened. That's why this public inquiry is taking place, and hopefully have recommendations as to how these type of situations do not repeat again. Of course, this is not to take away from people's right to protest peacefully, but what we saw in Ottawa, what we saw in our borders, was not nor peaceful or lawful.
Mm-hmm. Again, echoed by the Premier, but you know, to listen to the Ottawa Mayor today, the Premier was not as engaged as he should have been in the early days. Mr. Green, I saw you shaking your head when you heard that.
It's absolutely ridiculous. If he's standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister, my question is where? the fact remains that the federal government, provincial government were nowhere to be found while the city of Ottawa was left to its own devices. You had residents who had to take to the streets to stop this terrorizing of their neighborhoods, to actually confront in a counter protest the terrorizing of their neighborhoods, while law and order was had completely evaporated and disappeared. And so, we have this situation where, yes, we have this judicial inquiry happening right now, but we also have, through legislation, the ability through the Parliament in our Joint Review Committee, which Mr. Naqvi is on, to have the facts presented to us. And the truth is that over the course of the last 6 months, while we've been trying to get to the bottom of this, the Liberal government has refused to provide answers to Canadians. And no matter which side of the debate people are on, in this particular moment, the most significant decision this House and this session will ever make, the public demands the truth. They demand to have the facts of the matter presented in a way where the public can decide, ultimately, whether or not the federal government met the threshold to invoke the Emergency Act under the CPAC Act Section 2.
Okay, so I'll give the last word then to you, Mr. Naqvi. Given what we just heard from Mr. Green, how does this inquiry inform the Joint Parliamentary Committee? How does it inform the road forward, do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm going to disagree with Mr. Green's characterization. I think the government, the federal government, is acting in the most transparent manner. There are two processes under Emergencies Act that are taking place. One, the joint committee that Mr. Green and I are part of, and the other, the public inquiry. Documents have been provided. Cabinet confidences have been waived. In fact, the Prime Minister will be testifying before the public inquiry as well. And several key ministers have been in front of the joint committee, and they will also be testifying at the public inquiry. So there's a lot of work going on because it was an unprecedented step, but I really believe, and I advocated for it, that it was a necessary step, because after 24 days of an illegal occupation in Ottawa, people were at their wits. Clearly, the Ottawa police was not able to manage or put an end to the situation, and therefore the extraordinary powers under the Act were put in place to help end the occupation and avoid any further blockades of our borders. And the proof, Michael, is that it did work, and we did end the occupation right here in Ottawa.
But going forward, how does the Commission inform what the Joint Committee is going to be doing? I hear you saying that at the end of the day it was effective, but effective is not what's at question here. Whether it was justified is what's questioned here.
That's correct.
Well, and again, I think the public inquiry is looking into this, the work that Joint Committee is doing, and there's a fair bit of evidence that has been generated, and there's more work to be done. All that cumulative evidence, all that cumulative testimony is going to allow us to look at not only the validity of the federal government's decision in invoking the Emergencies Act, which I believe was valid and was the right thing to do, but also to ensure that we learn lessons from this circumstance in order to avoid the same mistakes in the future.
Okay, well, the Commission continues its work. You guys are doing your work, so thank you to the two of you right now. We'll speak again, I'm sure. Yasir Naqvi, Matthew Green, thank you for the time tonight.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.